Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about the secret to using Aeldari transports in 10th edition. So, as many of you guys know, Eldar transports are very squishy. They're very fragile, especially in 10th edition. In 9th edition, they were fragile, but, so were a lot of other vehicles in the game, so they roughly matched up. And typically, they're only a little bit less fragile than the transports of other factions. However, in 10th edition, that is not so. Eldar transports pretty much got only a minimal boost in durability, whereas other factions got a much bigger buff to their durability. And that puts Eldar in the range of some of the squishiest vehicles in the entire game. And that has led some players to believe that Eldar transports are typically just not worth taking. Yes, we want the fire prisms, the night spinners, because those can hide behind terrain and deal damage from afar. They don't really have to engage with enemies, so durability isn't a big deal. But when I have to use a Falcon or a Wave Serpent that might have to put itself in harm's way to deliver its cargo, that's another story. That's something you're not quite comfortable using, and maybe something that you forego in your lists. However, Eldar transports are really strong. You just need to know how to use them correctly and position them on the battlefield. So what we're going to do in today's video is we're going to talk about the secrets to using Aeldari transports and how to get the most out of them in your games. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right into it. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at in today's video. We're going to be looking at the stats, weapons, and special rules of both Eldar transports, so both the Falcon and Wave Serpent. We're going to be looking at their strengths and weaknesses, movement and positioning, and I do have some graphics for you guys to explain this a little bit. We're going to be going over some crafty Eldar tips and tricks you can use to abuse your opponents with transports, and lastly, the role of transports in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of them. So starting off with the Falcon, it is very fast at movement 14, as all Eldar vehicles really are. It has a 3+ save, toughness 9, and 12 wounds, making it pretty squishy. Again, like I said before in the beginning of the video, Eldar transports didn't really get a huge buff in toughness, so they are on the squishier side. Most weapons will wound them on a 3+ that are designed to kill vehicles. As for its ranged weapons, it can take one of any Eldar heavy weapon plus a pulse laser. The Aeldari missile launcher is a good versatile weapon, decent against large or infantry targets, but not as specialized. The Bright Lance is your premier anti-large weapon. It's typically, the choice players make when they're choosing their weapon. It's really good when paired with the pulse laser as well, which is an effective weapon against lighter monsters or vehicles, and also heavy infantry or mounted units. If you don't want to go with the Bright Lance, you could go with the Scatter Laser, which is an anti-horde tool, or the Shuriken Cannon, which is an anti-MEQ tool, or the Star Cannon, which is good anti-MEQ as well, but a bit more specialized. And lastly, if you don't want to do the Shuriken Cannon Underslug, you can do a twin-linked Shuriken Catapult, which is good for secondary objective opportunities, it being an assault weapon. As for the melee weapon on this thing, it comes with the Wraithbone Hull, so, it's not great, but it does have strength 6, so you can make decent tank shocks with it and guarantee yourself at least a couple of mortal wounds. As for the special abilities of the Falcon, it has Deep Strike, which, there's not really a reason to use anymore since you can't disembark on the same turn you come in, so that's kind of a bummer, but, it is there. Maybe in certain circumstances you might want to use it, but in general, you're not going to be using it that much. Its real ability, though, is Fire Support, which basically means that units that disembark from it get to reroll wounds against a target that the Falcon hit with its ranged weapons. So things like Fire Dragons coming out of there, rerolling wounds is absolutely amazing. Fire Dragons, of course, being a little bit on the lower side of strength with their fusion guns, have trouble wounding tougher targets, so this really makes up for that. But it doesn't just stop there. This also applies to anything coming out of the Falcon, including things like a Death Jester, for example. Death Jesters can fit in here, come out of this, reroll wounds against their target. And of course, we know Death Jesters have Fate's Messenger, but they also have devastating wounds on their weapons. So they can get a lot of, basically free kills if they disembark from this thing against tougher targets, which is a really strong ability. And, this thing is decent with other infantry as well, like Dire Avengers, and, if you're more brave, Howling Banshees as well. And, just saying, Striking Scorpions are typically used to infiltrate, but if you want to use them for damage dealing, coming out of a Falcon is very strong as well, because they do also have devastating wounds. As for its war gear options, it can replace its scatter laser with another Eldar heavy weapon, typically a bright lance, but in some cases you might want to go a different route if you already have enough anti-large in your list, and can also take a shuriken cannon instead of the twin shuriken catapult. So this is a little bit of a debate whether or not you should keep the twin shuriken catapult, because it does give you a little bit more secondary objective opportunities. But the couple of times I've run it, I haven't really run into any situations where it ended up being useful. And in some situations, I actually did miss having the shuriken cannon. So, it's definitely up to you. It depends on how your games go, how your terrain setups are, and stuff like that. But, this is one of those things that it's really up to you what you take. There's no correct option as far as what weapon to take. Either the twin shuriken catapult for extra secondary objectives or the shuriken cannon for extra damage. When the Falcon is damaged, it does get a -1 to hit when at 4 wounds or below. That's not really that big of a deal, especially on squishy targets like the Falcon. If the Falcon is getting hit to the point where it's at 4 wounds or less, it's probably just going to die, so you don't need to worry about this too much. And as far as its transport capacity, it can transport 6 models, which basically just means it can transport Eldar infantry models. So can't really transport Wraith constructs. I know they say Wraith constructs take the space of 2 models, but under most circumstances, you're not going to be able to do it. Now, there is a special circumstance where if, you have a couple of Wraiths die, you can hop the Wraiths into the transport and they can actually benefit from its fire support ability. But it's extremely rare and will probably almost never happen. As far as its points cost go, it does cost 140 points, which actually now, since all of the nerfs have happened and stuff, is actually great value compared to the Fire Prism or Night Spinner, which cost 180. So this thing comes with a Bright Lance, it comes with a Pulse Laser, which are very powerful weapons. They're not as powerful as a Prism Cannon, but this thing also costs much less and can transport infantry and also give them rerolls to wound. So it does have really good value when compared to these other options. As far as its keywords go, it has the fly and vehicle keywords, meaning it can be hard to move it over ruins, which is also another reason why people are kind of shying away from the Falcon and Wave Serpent, because it can be difficult to maneuver. Whereas, a Night Spinner or Fire Prism, you really don't have to maneuver that much. It's usually just going to be in the back the entire game. Alrighty, so onto the Wave Serpent. The Wave Serpent pretty much has an identical stat line, except it has an additional wound. Basically, making it a little bit tougher. And actually, this does make a difference. I know it doesn't seem like it, but between the extra wound and the invul save, if you wanted to use that, Strands of Fate dice for an automatic success, it could make the Wave Serpent actually tougher to kill than it initially looks, which can be very good at throwing your opponent off. Now, it won't happen often, but when it does happen, it is satisfying. As far as its weapon options go, I think this is what kind of makes the Wave Serpent a less popular pick because, well, its weapon options aren't that good, especially when you consider the twin linked ability really doesn't mesh well with unparalleled foresight. So it can take any Eldar heavy weapon, but, just a twin linked version of that. Eldar missile launchers are good against large and infantry targets, but, of course, it's less specialized. You have the twin Bright Lance, which is good against large targets. You have the twin scatter laser, which is a good anti-horde tech, and the twin linked actually does matter with more shots because unparalleled foresight only allows you to reroll 1 wound roll. The twin shuriken cannon and star cannon are good at, dealing with marine equivalents, and the twin shuriken catapults are good for objectives. Personally, because of the nature of the Wave Serpent wanting to be in the mid-board, I like taking the shuriken cannons just because, they do have 24-inch range. You're not going to get much use out of it in your deployment zone. But it does come into play when you also consider that you're going to have an underslug shuriken cannon most of the times as well. So it actually makes it pretty good at dealing with marine equivalent targets. As far as its melee weapon, it does also come with the same Wraithbone hull as the Falcon for those awesome tank shocks. And on both vehicles, it is something you're going to want to keep in mind throughout the game because there are times where, tank shocking in and then, dealing your damage in close combat and pinning an enemy down is worth its weight in gold. As far as its abilities go, it doesn't have Deep Strike like the Falcon does, but it has the Wave Serpent Shield. Now, this ability was much better in the beginning of the edition, but then, they kind of nerfed it. They specified that it can only happen in the shooting phase, so that whole Battle Shock thing to deny Overwatch was basically killed. However, it does cause D3 mortal wounds in the shooting phase and does cause a battle shock test to an enemy unit within 12 inches. This can help you with Overwatch if you are actually planning on charging a unit in, but it typically won't help you after the movement phase. So, it is a little bit of extra mortal wound damage. It's not terrible. It does prevent enemies from using certain stratagems on them if they do fail that battle shock test, but, it's nothing to write home about. As far as its wargear options go, it can take a twin Eldar heavy weapon and exchange its twin shuriken catapults with a shuriken cannon. I personally prefer the cannon, but I've heard other players who prefer the catapults for that extra secondary scoring. And again, just like the Falcon, there's no right way to go about this. I just prefer the extra damage, but, if you do want the extra secondary objective potential, the catapults are the way to go. As far as its transport capacity, it can carry double the amount that the Falcon can, so 12 models, and Wraith Constructs count as 2. Typically, you're not going to want Wraith Constructs in this thing in general, but, you can transport Wraiths in it if you need to. As far as its point cost goes, it does come in at a budget cost of 120 points, which has not been nerfed, which is extremely good for a transport with a 5+ invulnerable save and a large transport capacity, and its damage isn't bad. If you compare it to something like a Raider from the Dark Eldar, I know the Dark Eldar, don't do so great as far as their tournament win rates and stuff like that, but they are a pretty decent army, and I think, when you compare this to a Raider, it does compare favorably for the cost. And as for its keywords, just like the Falcon, it has the fly and vehicle keywords, meaning it can be hard to move over ruins. Now, the other thing about this tank, though, is it's a little bit harder than the Falcon to move around because it has those little fins on the side of it. If you're like me and you're playing with a group of guys who really doesn't care too much about that stuff, they'll let some stuff slide and, it's not a big deal. But there are some terrain layouts where moving this thing through certain choke points can be difficult and you will have to fly over ruins and stuff, which can limit its movement. So do be careful about that and make sure that, when you're deploying your Wave Serpent, you keep this in mind. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the Falcon. So the strengths are it significantly increases the damage of the unit inside with rerolls to wound, and I can't stress enough how powerful this really is. It has a powerful anti-large shooting attack with the Pulse Laser and Bright Lance combined. Again, this is the combination I like using the best just because I also like pairing them with Fire Dragons, which are another potent anti-large tool. And they extend, of course, the threat range of the unit within and protects them. Their weaknesses, however, are that they are hard to maneuver at times, especially around and over ruins, and they are very fragile. As for the strengths and weaknesses of the Wave Serpent, it does have a 5+ invulnerable save, so can survive a bit longer, especially with Fate Dice, than the Falcon can. And for its budget cost of 120, this is really cool. It can potentially also battle shock enemy units and deal mortal wounds, and can transport 12 models, and of course, like all transports, it extends the threat range and protects units inside, especially important for squishy Eldar units. However, its weaknesses are that just like the Falcon, it is fragile, not as fragile as the Falcon, but still fragile, and its firepower is meh at best. A twin-linked weapon and a shuriken cannon is not exactly powerful shooting. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about movement and positioning, because this is something that a lot of players have trouble with when using Eldar transports, especially newer Eldar players who haven't been playing them for that long. So this can be tricky due to the size of the Wave Serpent and Falcon, as well as the unfortunate change to how fly works over terrain. So in 9th edition, it was really easy to maneuver these things because they could just fly over everything and basically be unhindered. So you could get them to the places they needed to be easier. But now, since you have to calculate movement over ruins, this can be a problem and actually can lead to scenarios where your Wave Serpent really can't move much farther past the ruin itself, which obviously is a big issue, especially if you need to get to a place on the board quickly. After they dump their cargo out, though, they still have a lot of room to disrupt and continue to deal damage, so this means that you really do need to make sure that you're moving them correctly and in the right positions. Because like all Eldar units, they're not exactly expendable. You can trade units, obviously. Eldar are really good at playing the trading game. Swooping Hawks and different units are costed to the point where you can trade with them, but you don't want to lose something for nothing, right? You don't want to lose a Wave Serpent for nothing in return, especially if you don't move to the right position fast enough. So what I want to do is show you a couple of examples from, the GW recommended terrain in Leviathan to show you how to move your transports in the beginning of the game to get to good positions on the battlefield where they're still safe, but can impact the game in a major way. So here is the recommended terrain layout number 1. This is what we're going to use for an example because basically it's the one that most people pick, at least from what I've seen, and it's the one that my group and I play on the most. So typically speaking, when you're deploying a Wave Serpent in your deployment zone, you want to make sure that turn 1, it's obviously behind a ruin. Now, personally, I like deploying it on the side of the board where you have the single ruin right there, because I think this gives you the most room to actually move out. If you look on the right side or the bottom left side of the board, you have those 2 L-shaped ruins right there. I actually think that little spot right there to the left of the 4x6 ruin is actually very hard to maneuver around and actually get into a good position. So technically that's why I prefer the 6x12 ruin on the top left. So you can either do 2 things. During the first turn, if you notice your enemy is trying to push up, you can put your Wave Serpent just between the 6x12 ruin and the 4x6 ruin on the top center of the board. Just like the diagram states, you can put it around to the left or right. It just depends on where you end up deploying your Wave Serpent. But either way, you should have the movement to get there because you do have movement 14 and you have to make sure that you're not moving over the ruin, but you're moving around it. So just in case you don't get the first turn, your Wave Serpent in those 2 positions in the back is still safe. Very few enemy armies are going to be able to actually have the maneuverability to both sight the Wave Serpent and kill it in 1 round if it's in those positions, considering the layout of terrain on the board. So once you move it up to that 6x12 piece of terrain, you just leave it there. Now, there's a couple of different options you can also use depending on what you have inside of the transport. So if your Wave Serpent has, Dire Avengers inside, which is going to be, 9 times out of 10 what you're going to have in a Wave Serpent, then if your enemy is going to engage you within 18 inches, you can basically dump your Dire Avengers out right then and there and have them sit in the ruin on an objective or something like that so that they can shoot at enemy units coming in. However, if you know that your enemy outranges you and can draw line of sight to your Dire Avengers without stepping into their Overwatch, you might just want to keep your Dire Avengers in the Wave Serpent for the time being and sit tight. Because then that way your opponent is going to have to engage with you in some way, or you'll be able to get the jump on them, move your Dire Avengers up, shoot them in their own side of the board, and that could be a big problem for them. So they're going to have to, try to deal with that Wave Serpent in some way, shape, or form. And based on the terrain layout, they may or may not be able to do that successfully. In most cases, an opponent is not going to want to sacrifice their bigger pieces and their more heavy damage dealing units to kill a Wave Serpent, which will leave them wide open to attack. So if you realize, or notice, I should say, where I place the Wave Serpent on the board, the only angles that your opponent could possibly kill it in are on the extreme top of the board, so that would be your left flank. And if your opponent puts something there, you can easily move a Warwalker out there to kill it. So if you have a couple of Warwalkers in the back, which you should have, any kind of heavy anti-large tool that your opponent uses to kill that Wave Serpent is going to be dead. So typically speaking, that anti-large weapon is going to be more points than a Wave Serpent. So if your opponent actually overextends like that to kill the Wave Serpent, yeah, the Wave Serpent didn't survive the battle, but it did bait in a much larger vehicle that you can now easily kill. And the Dire Avengers that are inside might lose a couple of models, but they're still functionable. Most likely your opponent is not going to be able to move multiple units in range to see the Dire Avengers, so they're going to be safe to shoot again the next turn. If we're talking about a Falcon, on the other hand, it's much of the same case. Yes, the Falcon is a little bit more expensive, but now your opponent can't safely move anti-large tools within a certain range of that Falcon because you have fire dragons inside of it. So most of the time you are going to have fire dragons in it. Fire dragons are going to come out and basically burn down anything for, much less points than that thing costs. And yes, fire dragons coming out of a Falcon can burn down a lot of heavier vehicles. especially with the Falcon's support. So between a Falcon and Fire Dragons, you can take out most heavy vehicles in the game. Of course, with a Fate dice to help you out a little bit and ensure that you get those kills. So either way, being able to move a vehicle into this spot is really hard for your opponent to deal with. And if you have the correct backup as well, you have the Night Spinners back there maybe, or you have War Walkers to make sure that, enemy units can't just kill the Wave Serpent or Falcon for free, then you've set yourself up for success. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, yeah, that's all well and good, Proxy Hammer, but what if I get second turn and my opponent is already on me and already to the midboard, which happens in a lot of games, right? You could be going against a very assault-heavy list with orcs, which are very fast in their trucks and things like that, or a Dark Eldar list that's just going to zoom up the board with raiders and venoms. Or, you have something like a Ravenwing list with a lot of bikes or something like that, right? There's a lot of lists in 40k out there that are very fast that on turn 1 can cross the midboard fairly easily and threaten your units in your deployment zone. So in these cases, you're not going to be able to move up your Wave Serpent like that and expect your Wave Serpent and or Dire Avengers to live through that second turn, right? Your opponent's second turn. So what you can do instead is you can do what I like to call a defensive posture. So this is a baiting tactic that I like using against opponents a lot. It basically kind of works with the assumption that your opponent is crossing the board very quickly, trying to engage you in combat, and trying to force you into your own deployment zone so that they can score a bunch of points on primary objectives. So in this example, your opponent is already crossing that line and they're going to be on you if you don't do anything, and they're going to corner you in your deployment zone. So what you do in this case is you move your Wave Serpent out ahead of your deployment zone, so ahead of whatever ruin you're going to be hiding behind in the first turn during deployment, and you just dump out your Dire Avengers or whatever it is behind the Wave Serpent. This is a tactic called Fish or Fury. It's been around for a while. But basically, the Wave Serpent acts as a buffer between those assault units and your Dire Avengers. So the cool thing about 10th edition, though, is we have some additional tricks we can use to kind of even push this further. So your opponent sees something like this, and they're immediately going to say, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and charge the Wave Serpent. That's going to give me enough movement to probably try to consolidate and hit the Dire Avengers as well. And if I get a good enough charge roll, I may even be able to wrap around the side of the Wave Serpent and engage the Dire Avengers very quickly. So your opponent's going to move forward in their movement phase as close as possible to that enemy Wave Serpent as they can. Now, this is going to give your Dire Avengers the option of overwatching them, which they will do, and they will kill some models with it. And then after they're done overwatching, at the end of the movement phase, you can simply phantasm back on the other side of the ruin. Now, that's the first thing you can do, and you can, in fact, leave the Wave Serpent out there just to engage the orcs or whatever units are going to assault the Wave Serpent in combat. And you can save the command points. Or you can spend the command points and fire and fade back behind the ruin. So basically what happens here is not only does your opponent not have a target anymore, but now their units are out in the open for your other units to shoot at when it comes to your turn. So those units didn't stay in the midboard, they pushed forward, they tried to pin you in your deployment zone, but now they're out of position and they're not scoring on primary objectives. So in your turn, you can also pop back out with the Dire Avengers, shoot the remainder of the orcs, and you can use the Wave Serpent to maybe, use its ability, assault one of the units, tank shock it, and pin it in place so that your army has some breathing room and you can actually get out of your deployment zone. And this is something that I've used quite a few times, and it just takes a little bit of patience and resource management. Again, you do need to make sure you have the correct number of command points and things like that to pull this off, but a lot of times players in this position will panic. They'll just try to throw as much as possible at the opposing army to try to break free, and in the process leave themselves very open to attack. And of course, Eldar don't do well in those situations. Or even worse, they'll be afraid to move out of their deployment zone and they'll just kind of stay back and hide, and the orc player or whatever kind of army you're fighting against will have full control of the board. So in these situations, you do need to use a little bit of Eldar trickery and movement shenanigans to be able to get out of this kind of situation. All right, so now that we've looked at those diagrams, let's talk about some of the other crafty Eldar tips and tricks you can use to abuse your opponents. So engaging units in close combat with your Wave Serpent can actually be very good, and it can deal a surprising amount of damage between Tank Shock and its ability. So Tank Shock deals on average 3 mortal wounds. Its ability on average will deal 2 more, so that's 5 mortal wounds in total, plus all of the shooting that it has. And this is kind of why I like giving it shuriken cannons, because it does give it more power against infantry units. So if you need to bully a unit off of an objective or something like that, the Wave Serpent can definitely do it. So don't be afraid of tank shocking with this thing and using its ability to clear things off of objectives. Fire and Fade is also a great way to preserve your Falcon after disembarking and allows it to continue shooting. Now, not so useful with the Wave Serpent because its shooting isn't that great, but using this on a Falcon can be very useful because the Falcon has a good amount of firepower. It has the pulse laser and of course the bright lance, and that's not even counting the shuriken cannon you're probably going to give it as well. The Fish and Fury tactic is also very good when going up against assault armies to block charges, and kind of like the diagram that I showed you before, this gives your opponent the impression that you're trying to protect your unit from combat, but at the same time, because you have Phantasm, if you position your models correctly, you can also just Phantasm behind a ruin and also be immune to shooting from, most enemy shooting, aside from indirect fire. So that is a good thing to keep in mind as well, that you can use your Wave Serpents to protect your units from combat, and you can use this in conjunction with Phantasm to also protect them from shooting. Also, keep in mind, don't disembark your unit until the end of the phase to bait your opponent into using stratagems early or have them assume you won't get out of the transport. So basically you can disembark during any point in the movement phase, right? This means that you can move your Wave Serpent or Falcon up and continue to move other units in your army before you actually choose to disembark your units. So my advice would be always disembark your units dead last. That's the last thing you should do because that will give you a greater idea of your opponent's intentions with their stratagem use and so forth, and will also provide more opportunities for you to deny Overwatch. Or at least bait your opponent into using Overwatch early so that your Fire Dragons and Dire Avengers and other units like that don't get shot up before they can do anything. Also keep in mind that the Serpent's ability can potentially prevent stratagem use in the shooting phase. It is rare, but it can be useful. So you can use it on units that you know are very tough, that are likely going to be using stratagems to buff themselves up even further. And of course, you can use this as a precursor to take down those bigger units in the game. Lastly, don't underestimate using the Feigned Retreat stratagem on Eldar transports that are engaged in combat, because it can be used to re-tank shock other units. So a great thing I like to do with the Feigned Retreat is actually engage my Wave Serpent in close combat one turn with something, insignificant, something I know that's not going to be able to kill the Wave Serpent. Deal some mortal wounds, deal some damage in close combat, and then when it's my turn again, if the Wave Serpent does survive, use the Feigned Retreat stratagem and re-engage another unit and tank shock another unit 14 inches away. I think this is a very good use of command points. Yeah, you might not always have the extra command points to do something like that, or you might not actually have the opportunity to charge another unit using Feigned Retreat, but it can be a very clutch play and disrupt your opponent in a very serious way in the mid game and also in the late game as well. Alrighty, so what is the role of transports in an Eldar army and how do you make the most out of them? So first and foremost, Eldar transports ensure that their cargo gets to the optimal engagements on the battlefield, but they're not just good at that, they're also a fantastic disruption tool when used properly. Using things like tank shock, assaults, and the Fish or Fury tactic can ensure that your Wave Serpents and Falcons can be much more useful on the battlefield than they would suggest on paper. They can block charge lanes, deny objectives, and tie up enemies in combat, and those are all really important factors to ensuring that you get the most value out of them. If you're not doing these things throughout the game with your Wave Serpents and Falcons and things like that, you're not utilizing them to their fullest potential. And yeah, there might not always be opportunities to do this, but if you do see opportunities arise, take them. Because oftentimes what that's going to do is it's going to set you up for more success down the road. If your opponent has to worry about a Wave Serpent that's constantly assaulting their units and disrupting them and blocking charge lanes and movement lanes and them from getting onto primary objectives and stopping them from scoring secondary objectives and so forth, then they're not worrying about your heavier units, your heavy damage dealers. And if your heavy damage dealers can survive the entire game, and your secondary objective scorers can survive the entire game, you're going to win, and you're going to win in a very big way. And typically, Falcons and Wave Serpents aren't that expensive. Falcons are 140 points, Wave Serpents are 120. They're not super expendable, but they're cheap enough to where if you do lose them doing something important, it's not that big of a deal. So in conclusion, while certainly not as tough or maneuverable as they used to be, our flying transports are still considerably useful and have some really effective tricks up their sleeves. The key to their success, however, is good positioning, board management, and most of all, patience. You have to wait for the right moment to strike and the right moment to position your troops accordingly. And also really make sure that you're adapting to the current board state. And to give you an example of this, let's say that it's not possible for you to move your Dire Avengers up to the mid-board because your opponent got the first turn and, like the examples I gave you, they were playing a very fast army. So if you moved your Dire Avengers up and dumped them out, they'd probably get overwatched and killed. So in that situation, maybe you don't dump them out. Maybe you keep them in the Wave Serpent, but you move them up into a position where they can affect the battle more. Or you use that tactic I described with the Fisher Fury, which is you move the Wave Serpent up, you drop the Dire Avengers behind it, and let your, primarily assault-based enemy come to you. So you might have to change your game plan up a little bit, just depending on what your opponent does and also what kind of opponent you're facing. And that, at its core, is what makes Eldar a tough faction to play, because we don't have a singular game plan like other factions. We do have to adapt to the situation, but if we learn to adapt to different situations well and we become more seasoned and experienced at doing so, we're oftentimes going to get the better end of it. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly appreciated. If you do want to support the channel and join our channel's Patreon, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to rep some Eldar-inspired apparel at your local game store to show off your favorite faction and the best faction in the game, or you want to get some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will leave those links in the description as well. Lastly, if you are interested, check out the Eldar Knights Kickstarter below. I started a Kickstarter for the project so that we can get some cool art and perhaps even STL files for the Eldar Knights, which is a fan dex I've been working on for 10th edition. And the rough draft of it is complete. I have played a few practice games with it, and so far it's looking pretty balanced. It's looking pretty good. It's not super OP or anything. It is, kind of at its early stages of development. So there might be a few changes here and there, but, it doesn't look to be super overpowered or anything like that. I think I did a pretty good job balancing the rules a little bit. So we'll kind of have to wait and see on that. But if you do want to be a part of the play testing as well, again, you can go ahead and get access to the official rough draft of the fan decks through my channel Discord. And once again, for those of you guys wondering how to gain access to the channel's Discord, you just have to become a Patreon member, and of course, free trials are activated, so it will be at no cost to you. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.